If you were forced to watch a life hanging in the balance, with only seconds to make a decision that could save or condemn, what would you do? Prepare yourself to hear a deeply moving story of struggle, courage, and the incredible bond between humans and animals that transcends all expectations. This isn't just another story, it's a testament to how split-second decisions can forever alter the course of lives. A tale that unfolded on a scorching summer day in Portland, Oregon, where fate brought together a helpless creature and an unlikely hero when all seemed lost. Meet Rusty, a 3-year-old golden retriever with eyes that could melt the coldest heart, fur the color of honey in sunlight, and a spirit that radiated pure joy to everyone he encountered. Rusty wasn't just a pet to the Thompson family. He was the beating heart of their home, the one who greeted each family member with uncontained excitement every single day. Elena Thompson, a dedicated nurse and mother of 2, had adopted Rusty when he was just a puppy, rescuing him from a shelter where he'd been abandoned. The bond between them was immediate and profound, with Rusty becoming not just her companion, but her emotional support through long hospital shifts and life's countless challenges. The Thompsons lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood where children played freely in the streets and neighbors knew each other by name. It was the kind of place where people still borrowed cups of sugar and gathered for weekend barbecues, a slice of American community that seemed increasingly rare in our disconnected world. Then there was Jackson Reed, a construction worker passing through Portland for a temporary job. At 34 years old, Jackson carried the weight of a troubled past on his broad shoulders, years of mistakes and regrets that had left him distant from others, preferring to keep to himself rather than form connections. Jackson had never owned a pet, never understood the deep attachment people formed with their animals. He'd grown up in a household where animals were seen as just that, animals, not family members deserving of unconditional love and devotion. This perspective colored his interactions with the world. On this particular day, the temperature in Portland had reached an unbearable 102 degrees, the kind of heat that shimmered above the pavement and made breathing feel like drawing air through a warm, damp cloth. Weather forecasters had been warning residents about the dangers the heat posed, especially to children and pets. Elena had never intended to leave Rusty in the car, not even for a minute. She was always so careful, so conscious of the dangers. But that day, a series of unexpected events and a momentary lapse would set in motion a chain reaction that nobody could have foreseen. The morning had begun like any other, Rusty bounding around the house as the Thompsons prepared for their day, his tail wagging with such force it seemed capable of powering a small turbine. Eleanor's children, Lily and Ethan, had giggled as they always did when Rusty attempted to help them get ready for summer camp. It was supposed to be a quick errand, just 5 minutes to drop off a prescription at the pharmacy on her way to work. Eleanor had left the air conditioning running, the car securely locked with Rusty comfortably settled in the back seat. But then she received the call that would change everything. Her youngest patient, a 5-year-old boy fighting leukemia, had taken a turn for the worse. The hospital needed her immediately, her expertise critical in a situation where minutes could mean the difference between life and death. In her rush to respond to the emergency, the unthinkable happened. A freak electrical malfunction in her car's system caused the vehicle to lock down completely, the engine still running, but the electronic systems going haywire. The air conditioning shut off, and worse, the automatic window controls failed. As if this weren't devastating enough, a broken pipe beneath the street had begun leaking, sending water rising gradually around the lower portion of the car. As the minutes ticked by, Rusty's situation grew increasingly dire. The temperature inside the car climbed rapidly, while water began seeping in through invisible cracks in the car's undercarriage. The beloved pet who had brought so much joy to the Thompson family now sat alone, confused, and increasingly distressed as both heat and water threatened his very existence. Inside the car, Rusty began to pant heavily as the temperature climbed mercilessly. His golden fur, normally so lustrous, grew damp with sweat and the encroaching water. His eyes, usually bright and attentive, now darted around in confusion and mounting fear as he sensed the danger of his situation. The water was rising steadily, having already covered the floor mats and beginning to soak into the lower portions of the seats. What had started as a small leak was growing more substantial as the broken water main beneath the street continued to flood the depression where Eleanor's car was parked, creating a bizarre scene. a vehicle slowly filling with water under the blazing summer sun. Meanwhile, Eleanor had arrived at the hospital, rushing to her young patient's bedside without a moment to spare. The boy, fighting for his life, needed her complete focus and expertise. She had no idea that across town, her beloved Rusty was facing a life-threatening emergency of his own, trapped in what was quickly becoming both an oven and a fish tank. Back in the parking lot, the car's internal temperature had already surpassed 120 degrees, a lethal level for any living being. Rusty's breathing had become increasingly labored, his body struggling to regulate temperature as the heat sapped his energy. The water, now reaching his belly as he stood anxiously on the back seat, only added to his confusion and stress. Jackson Reed was walking past the pharmacy, his mind occupied with calculations for the day's construction work ahead, when a faint sound caught his attention. At first he wasn't sure what he'd heard, perhaps nothing at all, but something made him pause, made him listen more carefully to what seemed like a muffled whimpering coming from a nearby car. The sight that greeted Jackson when he approached the vehicle struck him immediately as wrong. A dog, clearly in distress, pacing anxiously on the back seat of a car that was inexplicably filling with water. The windows were completely fogged with condensation from the extreme heat inside, creating an apocalyptic greenhouse effect that Jackson immediately recognized as deadly. Jackson looked around frantically, expecting to see the owner rushing back, keys in hand, ready to rectify what must be a terrible mistake. But the parking lot remained empty, save for a few parked cars, their owners nowhere in sight. No one was coming to help. No one else had even noticed the unfolding tragedy. He tried the door handles first, all locked. He knocked on the windows, hoping to reassure the distressed animal inside while he figured out what to do. Rusty responded with desperate pawing at the glass, his eyes pleading in a way that pierced through Jackson's usually impenetrable emotional armor. The water inside was now covering half the back seat, forcing Rusty to stand with his front paws on the back dash to keep his head above the rising tide. His breathing had become shallow and rapid, a clear sign of heat stroke setting in. Jackson estimated that without immediate intervention, the dog had minutes, not hours, to live. Jackson pulled out his phone and dialed 911, quickly explaining the emergency to the dispatcher. There's a dog trapped in a car that's filling with water and overheating at the same time. The corner of Maple and 4th, outside Riverdale Pharmacy. The dispatcher promised to send someone immediately, but warned it might take at least 15 minutes for emergency services to arrive. 15 minutes. Jackson looked at Rusty, whose movements were becoming increasingly sluggish as the combined threats of hypothermia and drowning took their toll. The dog wouldn't last 15 minutes. The water was now reaching Rusty's chest as he balanced precariously on the back dash, his legs trembling with the effort to stay above the waterline. "I can't wait," Jackson muttered, ending the call and looking around for something, anything he could use to break into the car. He remembered the tools in his truck parked just down the block. He sprinted to his vehicle, grabbed a hammer from his toolbox, and raced back to the drowning dog, his heart pounding with urgency. In the hospital across town, Elena was washing her hands after stabilizing her young patient when a strange feeling of dread washed over her. Something was wrong. She couldn't place it at first, but then a horrifying realization struck her. Rusty was still in the car. In the chaos of the emergency call, she had completely forgotten him. With shaking hands, she called her husband, who was at work across town. "David, I left Rusty in the car," she cried into the phone. "I got called in for an emergency and completely forgot. You need to go get him right now." David, hearing the panic in his wife's voice, immediately dropped everything and headed for his car, but he was at least 20 minutes away. Back at the pharmacy parking lot, Jackson stood before the car, hammer in hand, faced with a decision. Breaking into someone's vehicle was a crime. He knew that much. He could be arrested, charged with property damage, forced to pay for repairs. For a man with his record, any brush with the law could mean serious consequences. But the alternative, doing nothing, meant certain death for the innocent creature trapped inside. Time seemed to slow down as Jackson stood there, hammer gripped tightly in his hand, sweat trickling down his face, not just from the heat but from the weight of the decision before him. In that moment, staring into Rusty's pleading eyes through the fogged window, something shifted inside Jackson, a barrier breaking, a wall crumbling down. "Hang on, buddy," he whispered, his voice barely audible even to himself. He wasn't just talking to the dog anymore. He was speaking to something deeper, something that had been locked away inside himself for far too long. His capacity for compassion, for connection, for caring about something beyond his own isolated existence. Jackson positioned himself at the rear passenger window, the farthest from Rusty, to avoid injuring him with flying glass. He took a deep breath, raised the hammer, and with a swift, decisive motion, brought it crashing against the tempered glass. The window didn't break on the first strike, only spiderwebbing with thin cracks across its surface. The sound of the hammer striking glass drew attention from passers-by, who began to gather at a distance, their expressions a mixture of confusion and concern. "What are you doing?" someone called out. "That's not your car." Jackson ignored them, focusing entirely on the task at hand, knowing that each second counted in Rusty's fight for survival. With a second powerful strike, the window finally shattered, collapsing inward in a shower of small glass pellets that immediately allowed the superheated air to escape in a visible wave of distortion. The sudden influx of cooler outside air created a momentary vacuum that seemed to pull at Jackson's clothes as he reached through the jagged opening. Water immediately began pouring out through the broken window, cascading onto the pavement in a steady stream. The car had been holding more water than Jackson had initially realized, nearly 2 feet at its deepest point. Rusty, who had been standing on his hind legs with his front paws braced against the back dash, was soaked through, his golden coat dark and heavy with water. "Come here, boy," Jackson called softly, reaching his arms through the broken window, ignoring the sharp glass edges that tore at his skin, drawing thin lines of blood across his forearms. Rusty hesitated, unfamiliar with this stranger, but desperation and instinct drove him toward the promise of escape and fresh air. With gentle but urgent movements, Jackson managed to get his hands under Rusty's front legs, lifting the waterlogged dog through the window opening. Rusty was heavier than he looked, his fur saturated with water, his body limp with exhaustion. It took all of Jackson's strength to pull him safely through without further injury from the broken glass. Once free from the car, Rusty collapsed onto the pavement, his breathing rapid and shallow, his tongue hanging limply from his mouth. The dog's body was dangerously overheated, his pulse racing as his system struggled to cope with the extreme conditions he'd endured. Jackson knew from a first aid course years ago that the next few minutes would be crucial. A woman from the gathering crowd stepped forward, introducing herself as a veterinary technician. "He needs to be cooled down gradually," she instructed, kneeling beside Rusty and checking his gums, which had taken on an alarming bluish tint. "We need to get him to a vet immediately. He's suffering from heat stroke and possible water inhalation." Jackson didn't hesitate. "My truck is right over there," he said, already gathering the exhausted dog in his arms. "Can you call ahead to the nearest emergency vet?" The vet tech nodded, pulling out her phone as Jackson carefully lifted Rusty, cradling him against his chest like a child, mindful of the dog's labored breathing and trembling limbs. The small procession, Jackson carrying Rusty, followed by the vet tech and several concerned onlookers, made its way quickly to Jackson's truck. Someone had placed a call to the police about the break-in, and in the distance the wail of sirens could be heard approaching. Jackson knew he might have to answer for his actions, but in his mind, there was no question he'd made the right choice. As Jackson placed Rusty gently in the passenger seat of his truck, the dog's eyes flickered open, meeting Jackson's gaze with what seemed like understanding, perhaps even gratitude. It was a brief connection, lasting only seconds. But in that moment, something profound passed between man and animal, a recognition of one soul reaching out to save another. The nearest emergency veterinary clinic was only 5 minutes away, but to Jackson, it felt like an eternity. He drove with one hand on the wheel, the other resting lightly on Rusty's heaving side, offering what comfort he could. "Stay with me, buddy," he murmured as they sped through the streets of Portland. "You've got a family that needs you. Don't give up now." At the same time, Elena and David Thompson were racing toward the pharmacy from opposite sides of the city, each gripped by panic and guilt, unaware that their beloved pet was no longer in the car, but fighting for his life in the vehicle of a stranger. A man who, until an hour ago, had never understood the bond between humans and their animal companions. The veterinary clinic burst into action the moment Jackson arrived with Rusty in his arms. The staff had been alerted by the vet tech's call and were ready with cooling blankets, IV fluids, and oxygen. Heat stroke and possible water aspiration, Jackson explained breathlessly, as they whisked Rusty away into the treatment area, leaving him standing alone in the waiting room, his shirt soaked with water and the dog's fur. Jackson sank into a chair, suddenly aware of the cuts on his arms from the broken glass, the blood mixing with water and drying in crusty streaks. His hands were shaking, adrenaline still coursing through his system. He stared at his phone, wondering if he should call the police himself, explain what had happened before they tracked him down for vandalizing someone's car. Before he could decide, the clinic doors burst open and a panicked couple rushed in. The woman still wearing hospital scrubs, the man in a business suit with the tie askew. "Our dog," the woman gasped to the receptionist. "A golden retriever. Someone called and said he was brought here. Is he—" Her voice broke, unable to finish the question that terrified her most. The receptionist glanced toward Jackson, who had risen to his feet, recognition dawning on his face. "Are you the Thompsons?" he asked quietly. The couple turned, noticing him for the first time, this stranger with wet clothes and bleeding arms, who somehow knew their name. "Your dog is Rusty. He's in treatment now. I'm the one who found him." What followed was a blur of explanations and emotions as Elena and David learned of their pet's rescue. Elena's hands flew to her mouth when Jackson described the rising water, the suffocating heat, how close Rusty had come to dying alone in that car. "I had to break the window," Jackson explained, bracing for anger about the damage to their vehicle. Instead, Elena reached out and gripped his bleeding arm, tears streaming down her face. "You saved him," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You saved our Rusty when I—" She couldn't continue, overcome by guilt and gratitude in equal measure. David stepped forward, extending his hand to Jackson. "We can never thank you enough," he said simply, his own eyes glistening. The emergency veterinarian emerged from the treatment area, her expression serious but not grave. "Rusty is stabilizing," she reported. "The heat stroke was severe, and he did inhale some water, but we've started treatment in time. The next 24 hours will be critical, but I'm cautiously optimistic. He's a strong dog with a powerful will to live." Relief flooded through the Thompsons, Elena collapsing into a chair with a sob of thanks. Jackson stood awkwardly nearby, feeling suddenly like an intruder in this family moment. He began to edge toward the door, thinking he should leave them to their reunion, but David noticed and stopped him. "Please stay," he said. "You're part of this now." Those simple words, "You're part of this now," echoed in Jackson's mind as he allowed himself to be guided back to a seat. How long had it been since anyone had made him feel part of anything? Years, perhaps. Not since before his life had spiraled into the series of mistakes and regrets that had left him so isolated, so determined to avoid connections. The police arrived shortly after, responding to calls about the car break-in. Jackson stood to meet them, ready to accept responsibility for his actions, but Elena and David immediately stepped forward, explaining the situation, making it clear that the damage to their car was not only justified, but deeply appreciated. The officers, after taking statements, left without charging Jackson. As the hours passed in the veterinary clinic waiting room, a strange thing happened. The Thompsons and Jackson talked, really talked. Elena shared stories of Rusty as a puppy, how he'd helped her through the darkest days of the pandemic, when she'd worked endless shifts in the ICU. David spoke of how the dog had helped their children open up after a difficult move to Portland. Hesitantly at first, then with increasing openness, Jackson shared pieces of his own story. The poor choices that had led to his estrangement from family, the loneliness of his nomadic construction work, how he'd hardened himself against connections because they seemed to always end in pain. "I never understood people's attachment to pets," he admitted, "until today." Late that evening, the veterinarian allowed them into Rusty's treatment room. The dog was awake, hooked to IV fluids and monitoring equipment, but his tail thumped weakly against the examination table when he saw Elena and David. What surprised everyone, though, was his reaction to Jackson, a deliberate lifting of his head, a focused gaze that seemed to contain recognition. "He knows you," Elena said softly, watching as Jackson cautiously approached the table. "He knows you're the one who saved him." Jackson reached out a tentative hand, and Rusty summoned the strength to lick his fingers once, a gesture so simple yet profound that Jackson felt something crack open inside his chest, a door long sealed shut, finally allowing light to enter. Over the next 3 days, as Rusty recovered his strength in the veterinary hospital, Jackson found himself drawn back to check on the dog's progress. The Thompsons were always there, and gradually the awkwardness between them dissolved. They exchanged phone numbers, shared meals in the waiting room, and even laughed together as Rusty began to show his playful personality again. 1 week after the incident, Rusty was finally cleared to go home. His recovery had been remarkable, the veterinarian noting that his youth and previously excellent health had helped him survive what would have been fatal for many animals. As the Thompsons prepared to take Rusty home, they made an unexpected request of Jackson. Would he come visit them the following Sunday for a special thank-you dinner? Jackson had never been one for social gatherings, especially with people he barely knew. His instinct was to politely decline, to retreat back into the safety of his solitude. But when he looked at Rusty, now standing steadily on his own feet, amber eyes bright with renewed life, he found himself accepting the invitation before he could overthink it. The Thompson home was exactly as Jackson had imagined it would be. Warm, inviting, filled with family photos and the comfortable chaos of a house where children and pets were cherished. Lily and Ethan, the Thompson children, had prepared hand-drawn cards for Mr. Jackson the hero and presented them with shy smiles and whispered thanks for saving their beloved pet. What struck Jackson most as he sat at their dinner table was how naturally he had been folded into their world, as if rescuing Rusty had somehow made him family. Elena had learned of his temporary housing situation while working in Portland and insisted he consider their guest room for the remainder of his contract, an offer that would have seemed intrusive a week earlier but now felt like a lifeline. Rusty, for his part, had appointed himself Jackson's personal companion, rarely leaving his side throughout the evening. The dog who had once been a stranger to him, whose life had seemed valuable primarily in the abstract, had become in just a few days a distinct personality, one who clearly regarded Jackson with a special kind of canine affection that transcended ordinary gratitude. "It's remarkable," David observed, watching Rusty rest his head on Jackson's knee during dessert. "He's always been friendly, but I've never seen him attached to someone so quickly. It's almost like he understands exactly what you did for him." Jackson ran his hand along Rusty's silky ears, marveling at how natural the gesture felt now, how quickly he'd come to cherish this connection. Before that fateful day, Jackson would have scoffed at the idea that an animal could change a person's life trajectory. Yet here he was, considering Elena's offer to stay, contemplating reaching out to his estranged sister for the first time in years, feeling something like hope unfurling in his chest, all because of a dog trapped in a car and the split-second decision to help. 2 months later, Jackson's temporary stay had stretched on, his construction contract extended and then converted to a permanent position with a Portland company. The guest room had become his room, and the Thompsons had become not just friends, but the closest thing to family he'd known in years. And Rusty had become his co-conspirator, adventure partner, and nightly companion, often sleeping at the foot of his bed. Sometimes life changes in dramatic, cinematic moments, the crash of a hammer through glass, the rescue of a drowning dog, but more often, transformation happens in the quiet aftermath, in shared meals and evening walks, in the gradual dismantling of walls built around the heart, in the realization that connection, for all its risks, is still the most powerful force for healing a wounded soul. For Rusty, the car incident had been a brush with death that his animal mind had already relegated to the past. For the humans whose lives had intersected because of him, it had become something more profound, a reminder that acts of courage ripple outward in ways we can never fully anticipate, that sometimes saving another life is the first step towards saving our own.